Welcome to Biblical Foundations, a podcast of the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm your co-host, Jimmy Rowe, along with Dr. Andreas Kostenberger. Join us as we discuss issues in biblical scholarship for the church. Thank you for joining us today at Biblical Foundations. Here with me is Dr. Andreas Kostenberger. Today, our guest is Dr. Eckhard Schnabel. Dr. Schnabel is the Mary French Rockefeller Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. He is a prolific scholar and author, having written several commentaries and a notable two-volume work titled Early Christian Mission. And we're very excited to have Dr. Schnabel with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, well, Eckhard, I've known you for quite some time, and so I know a little bit more about your background, but I think many people just know you from some of the books that you've written, but I believe you also served as a missionary for many years, and of course, you've significantly contributed to the literature on missions. So can you tell our listeners, first of all, a little bit about yourself, your family, your background?
Well, as my accent betrays, I am German, more particularly Southern German.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus spoke Aramaic with a Galilean accent. So
Yes.
those of us who have accents are in very good company. After doing PhD studies, we served for 4 years with the Overseas Missionary Fellowship, which is the old Chinese mission in the Philippines. Now, I was teaching New Testament. I would say as a classical or maybe more authentic definition of a missionary is anyone who has been sent by God, but more particularly, I think in the New Testament, those who establish churches, who are
Yes.
pioneer missionaries. And so that's not what I did. I was involved in church planting during my language study period, just for a little bit, but that was more observation. And so I taught the New Testament for 4 years in the Philippines, but was also preaching in churches. And so before I had been doing PhD studies, I served with Operation Mobilization for 2 years, and there I was involved quite a bit in evangelism. And so it became pretty quickly obvious that this is not something that some people do, but when we read the New Testament, this is a very important dimension. When I returned to Germany, I was asked by the Freie Theologische Hochschule Seminary in Gießen, Germany. They had just lost their missiologist who had retired. And so they asked me to teach missiological classes, but I said, no, you keep looking for a missiologist. But I could teach a class on mission in the New Testament. This is really how all that started.
Yes.
And I quickly realized that there was really no book that had ever summarized what we know or what we would like to know, discussing some of these questions. The bibliography was very large eventually, but authors focused on not on a synthesis, but on all kinds of other areas. And I became more and more convinced how important that topic is, because arguably all the authors of the New Testament at one point or the other worked as church planting missionaries. Luke accompanying Paul, and if we believe that Matthew is the voice of Peter, he would have traveled evidently with Peter. We have John, who was active in Asia Minor, and even in Jerusalem, although there the focus is on Peter preaching. And of course, we have Matthew. We don't know where Matthew was, but the Great Commission was given to the 12 apostles, not to Paul. So in other words, when we look at the New Testament, we look at a situation where the leaders of the church very often would send out their best people, like the church in Antioch. And where some of the main theologians, like Peter and Paul and John, were actively involved in missionary or evangelistic outreach. And I think this was lost surely not only after Constantine, but maybe after the 8th or 9th century, at least in Europe, after Charlemagne had forced the Saxons to become believers, sometimes with force. And so after that, especially as infants were baptized, there were no pagans to convert. And conversion was not something to be talked about.
Yeah.
And so I felt this topic of mission in the New Testament really needs to be retrieved.
Yeah, especially if you know the current spiritual state of Germany and German-speaking Europe. It's just so vital. I'm grateful that you and I share that German heritage and also an interest in mission. And I remember actually reading your work, Early Christian Mission, die urchristliche Mission, actually in German before it came out in English. You actually translate your own works. So I think you wrote it in German and then translated it yourself, correct, into English?
Yeah, you might say I didn't trust anyone else because I was writing on archaeology and historical matters, geographical matters, exegesis, and theology. And I don't think there would be many translators who know the technical. I don't think my book is overly technical, but who knows some of the technical and even popular terminology in these areas. And so you could say it's maybe my quest for control.
Well, also you could do it a lot more quickly. I know sometimes if you have to wait for others, it may try your patience.
Then, my thinking was then I have to do a very careful proofreading. And probably the time I would spend on that, I would just use to translate it. I think it also made it cheaper for InterVarsity Press. So the arrangement was they would pay me for the translation, but I wouldn't receive royalties to make the thing work. Because to bring books out in English that were originally in German is very difficult for financial reasons.
You're right. That if you pay translators by the hour, that would have been astronomical. Since this is a 2-volume work. When he come out in 2000, was it 4 or 6? I guess depends on German, English, but around there.
I don't even recall. I think the German original came out in 2002, and the English edition, I think, 2 years later, 2004.
That's right. Now, I know that that book has been compared to that of the eminent German scholar Adolf Harnack century ago. I know you won some prizes for that as well. It's a monumental piece of scholarship. How would you compare your work to Harnack's, which is very different in many ways, but roughly covering some of the similar territory? And maybe a related question: why do you think missions is often neglected in New Testament scholarship and even in systematics? I mean, how many systematic theologies have a section on mission?
I was honored when people compared my work to Harnack, although as there are some pronounced theological differences, I was not sure how I should feel about being compared to Harnack. Well, Harnack, of course, wrote about the history of the early Christian church up to and including Constantine. And I stayed within the apostolic period. So in that sense, the comparison is not really fair.
Because he's more a church historian, right?
He's a church historian,
300 or so.
So, for example, what he writes on Paul in Athens and Areopagus is very brief. I forgot, it's maybe just a few pages where I've considerably more on Athens, the city of Athens itself, and then what Luke tells us Paul did in Athens and the Areopagus speech. I think the comparison was made simply because of the size of our two books and because Harnack wrote the synthesis, and this is what I did as well. So it seems with some reviewers who made that connection, it became lost that in terms of the content, I'm covering a much briefer period.
So for people who have not seen your work, can you maybe briefly summarize, the major, building blocks, if you will? I know you take a historical approach.
In the first section, I surveyed the Old Testament and Jewish texts, and came to the conclusion that others had come to before me, that neither in the Old Testament we have missionary work as an active work, as an active reality for Israel, who were told to treat foreigners as they would want to have been treated in Egypt, but they are not called upon to convert the pagans who were living within Israel. And that continued in terms of early Temple Judaism. There were pagans who became Jews. It seems that it was usually pagans who took the initiative, although we do find Jews in dialogue, missionary dialogue, we might say, with pagans. We don't know any figures. Some people said that there must have been an intensive Jewish proselytizing mission, because otherwise we wouldn't have so many proselytes. But we don't have any figures, so that argument actually falls completely flat. Although there were obviously, by the time we get to the first century, synagogues in diaspora communities, although most members seem to have been Jews who were living in other parts of the Roman world. There were also proselytes, and then there were God-fearers as well. Then in the next section, I discuss what we know about Jesus' itinerant activity, not staying at one place, but traveling, training his disciples to be fishers for people, and then giving the Great Commission, and Jesus himself encountering non-Jews, pagan Syrians. And so I just looked at all these texts. What do we know? What do scholars say? What are questions that have maybe not been asked? Then I looked at the early church in Jerusalem in terms of the 12 apostles. And for example, at passages like Acts chapter 1, where Jesus sends them to the ends of the earth, scholars generally said, well, this is simply a universalistic statement. They should go everywhere. And so I looked a little bit more carefully in terms of how this term, the ends of the earth, are used in Greek text and Jewish text, and came to the conclusion that while this is clearly a universalistic statement, it's not impossible that the disciples took the ends of the earth literally, in terms of Spain, in terms of what today we would call Sudan, and in the east it would be India, in the north it would be Scythia, as Paul in Colossians mentions a Scythian. The next section, which was the largest section, was on Paul, where I simply analyzed everything that is of interest, talked about bilingualism. When I talk about the disciples in the previous chapter, I talk about geographical knowledge among Jews, what would have been possible. I talk about maps in the ancient world, about travel routes. And then the next section was about Paul, tracing his missionary journeys, trying to convince people to abandon the 3 missionary journey paradigm, as Paul had worked as a missionary 10 years before he was then visiting Cyprus and Galatia, which is usually called the first missionary journey. And then I talked about the rest of the New Testament. I had then a a section on missionary strategy and missionary tactics, where obviously most of the information comes from Paul. And I realized if I summarize the let's say missionary theology, I would have to write a New Testament theology.
Yes.
And that would have been another 800 pages easily. And
and you do have a book, Paul the Missionary.
Yeah, that is more or less a summary of this Paul section of that book.
Yeah.
In the varsity, asked me to do like an abbreviated version and of the whole volume. But my proposal was then still 800 pages, and they said that's not a short book either. So they said maybe only do Paul. And which is what I did. The one new aspect in that book is I asked the question, was Paul a cross-cultural missionary?
Yes.
And my answer was no. That Paul was bilingual, he was bicultural. So he didn't really, of course, he crossed cultural barriers, but not in terms of his own personal history. Well, even the question is, did he even have to cross cultural boundaries as a diaspora Jew? He had lived as a rabbinical student, we might say, studying with Gamaliel in Jerusalem. So he was at home in Jewish culture, in Greco-Roman culture. And of course, as diaspora Jews would not feel that whenever they talk to a pagan, they cross a culture. Now, when Paul would interact with those who spoke Lycaonian in Lycaonia, that could be called cross-cultural, but they would have, of course, dialogued in Greek. And that takes the element of crossing a culture away. So it appears at the end on definitions, but I think the way we define a cross-cultural missionary today, you learn a language, you learn a culture, that Paul did not have to do.
That's very helpful. And I agree that's a distinctive contribution that for some people, it might be new to them to think of Paul in that way.
Yeah, I think some were even a little bit scandalized because they would go to Paul as an example of cross-cultural missions.
Yes. So to that second part of my question, that was a long, kind of a two-part question. The neglect of missions in New Testament scholarship, in systematic work as well. I should qualify that question by saying that it seems like maybe the last decade or decade and a half, we've seen definitely an increased interest. Your work, Chris Wright's book, The Mission of God, others. Craig Keener's massive 4-volume commentary on Acts, and so Howard Marshall, Tom Schreiner, others pointing out that Paul was really a missionary first, and then framed his theology in terms of missions. So, would you say that there's some hopeful signs, or are we still talking about a minority, and then the majority are still not giving missions its due as a topic in Scripture, and also St. Pauline studies, not adequately recognizing, that ultimately Paul was driven in large part by his missionary endeavors.
Yeah, I think that is correct. That there have been some very positive developments. I don't know whether that has anything to do with my work. One could always say, being maybe somewhat cynical, that New Testament scholars need topics, doctoral students need topics. But that makes it all the more surprising that the missionary reality of the New Testament was not talked about much earlier. And because it's so obvious, I think one might argue that as many critical scholars didn't take Acts seriously as a historical source for Paul, anyhow, that therefore they didn't take that seriously. Although I don't think that is really the case. I think it's just the weight of tradition. Paul was a theologian, which is, of course, what he was. I think one might link it with the personal history of most, at least European and maybe North American New Testament scholars as well. They were always part of the academy.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in the US, planting new churches has been a reality since a
Right.
very long time, right from the
Right.
beginning.
Yeah.
But not in Europe.
No.
Because pagans ceased to exist like in the 9th century,
Right.
thereabouts, and then people didn't really talk about conversion.
No.
And if you don't talk about much about conversion,
Yeah.
if you have infant baptism, everyone is a believer and should be treated as a
Right.
believer. Maybe they need to improve their lifestyle a little bit.
Right.
But if you don't talk about conversion, then you don't talk about evangelism, and then you don't talk about missions.
Yeah.
Luther was interested in Muslims. Actually, he was the first one in Europe to suggest that the Quran should be translated. But there is not a corresponding interest in maybe bringing them to Christ. Now, he had no models for doing that, although there were obviously the Nestorians, and he must have known about those, being in China. But that was a point I made in the first century when Jesus says that he wants to train disciples to fish for people in an international context. There was no model for that either.
Right.
And so I don't think Luther could easily use that as a tool. Although one might say he was busy enough with matters related to the Reformation. Then it was, of course, the Pietists, Zinzendorf and others, who really restarted the missionary movement. But it's very difficult to explain because Paul was sometimes treated as a pastor, although that needs to be done more as well.
Right. I think that's an advantage that we have as evangelicals with a high view of Scripture who believe in the importance of conversion and regeneration and mission, even as scholars, that we can give the missionary impetus behind many of the New Testament writings more appropriate attention than maybe sometimes done by other scholars.
Yeah, right. But they're indeed very good signs. There's a good number of books that discuss, for example, the nations in the Gospels by Florian Wilk. And just recently, a church historical dissertation came out discussing the history of early Christianity in Cilicia. And I was actually very surprised that the author takes up my suggestion that as Paul was in Cilicia for probably 10 years, he must have traveled. And I even make a suggestion about Eastern Cilicia, but only as an example, because there was a study I came across about villages being identified. And I argue that if the disciples learned anything from Jesus is you don't only focus on big cities, but you travel to villages as well, wherever people are willing to listen. And then this author makes the very interesting observation, and that I had not seen because I've not researched recently in that area, that an archaeological surface survey in Western Cilicia found over 100 new settlements. They can be traced back to the 1st and 2nd century.
Wow.
And so he actually refers to my work. I was rather intrigued that he said, well, Paul actually could have traveled in there. And he points out that in some of these places where we have some inscriptional evidence, the word Paul, the name Paul is actually more popular than in other areas. And now that's not a proof or anything, but he wonders whether that might be related to the apostle, at least being remembered, if not having been in. So this is, I think, a very positive development that people write about matters related to missionary work more so than they've done in the past.
I think it's important to realize that sometimes people don't know what they're missing if they're that's a blind spot in their theological work. I'm thinking, for example, of the debate about the pseudonymity of so-called pastoral epistles, and often by scholars who maybe don't sufficiently consider that the mission theme might actually shed some helpful light on that question, because you see that this is interwoven, right, with Paul's apostolic mission.
Thank you for joining us today at Biblical Foundations. For more information, please visit the Center for Biblical Studies at Midwestern at cbs.mbts.edu. For further resources, please also visit biblicalfoundations.org. Please join us again next time at the Biblical Foundations podcast.